No battery. Because I did turn it on, but the light's not on. Well, I had it on. When I took it out, there was no light. So we may be low battery. bring into their circle the prophet. There's a long history of prophets in Israel, and ideally they're cared for by the other people. That's not always the case. You remember Elijah, he went to a Shunammite woman to be cared for. I'm not saying they always did it, but that was part of what God expected when he sent somebody to them, that they would be taken care of. And so one way to kind of look at it, it's maybe some form of a test. How are you going to treat the stranger, the person you don't know, but especially the prophet? But I think Mark is doing more here. He tells us this one story of sending out. Because remember, Mark is trying to tell us and show us something here. Because he kind of just abruptly changes directions in the text. King Herod heard of it, verse 14. For Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying John the Baptizer had been raised from the dead. Now, it's an interesting storytelling here to me that Mark hadn't told us that John the Baptist has been beheaded yet. It's just kind of known. Some were saying John the Baptizer had been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers are at work in him. But others said it's Elijah. And others said it's a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. So this expectation that Jesus has set, I think on some levels is being met. People are going, this man is a prophet. And this word's getting back to Herod. And why does that matter to Herod? Well, he's thinking he's king of the Jews. Right? So it does matter, but as terrible as Herod seems to be, there's something underneath, right? He said he had heard of this Jesus. Verse 16, but when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. That would be a little terrifying, right? If you were the guy who executed somebody and he comes back, what are you thinking? We would expect he's coming for me. Well, but of course, we know the fuller story, and Mark backs up here starting verse 17 and fills in the previous history. For Herod himself, verse 17, had sent men who arrested John and bound him and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. Okay, so this part is tabloid, right? This would make a daytime soap opera kind of theme easy. He takes his brother's wife because he could. But we find out in verse 18, for John had been telling Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. When would it have been lawful for him to have his brother's wife? Yeah, when his brother died. So at least maybe it appears that Herod didn't have his brother killed. He just took his wife, which is unlawful. And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him. That's speaking of John the Baptist. That's the wife. She sounds like she jumped trains. She hooked up with what she thought maybe was the better of the two. Now that's me. I'm reading in the lines here a little bit. And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and protected him. And when he heard him, he was greatly perplexed. So when Herod listened to John, it bothered him. and yet he liked to listen to him. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and for the leaders of Galilee. And when his daughter Herodias, I hate when the mother and daughter or father and son have the same name. It just gets more confusing, right? When his daughter came in and danced, she pleased Herod. So remember, this is probably Herod, uncle / stepfather. Okay, this is not his own daughter, I don't think. When his daughter Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, so you can fill in the meaning of these words, right? He was so smitten with her, he says, ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it. And he solemnly swore to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you, even half of my kingdom. She went out and said to her mother, what should I ask for? Right? I got the genie in a bottle here. Well, what's my wish? She replied, the head of John the Baptizer. So again, I'm reading between the lines. Maybe the switch wasn't Herod's idea after all. Who knows? Again, it's tabloid or soap opera, whatever you want to put on it. Immediately she rushed back to the king and requested, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The king was deeply grieved because he liked listening to John. Even when John confused him or perplexed him. Yet out of regard for his oaths and for his guests, he did not want to refuse her. So he made a promise, give you whatever you want. She answered, he wasn't going to embarrass himself saying, well, but I ain't going to do that, right? It's more important to look good in front of all these people than stop from killing somebody. We can make weird justifications sometimes. Immediately the king sent a soldier of the guard with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl. Then the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard about it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. Now, this is a pretty gruesome, graphic story. And it comes right after the story of sending out the 12. What's Mark trying to tell us here? Here's this ambitious woman who marries a prince and then divorces him in order to marry his brother and become queen. They're denounced by the man of God. They censor they're censoring the bad press. This is not looking good. And the cunning mother finds a way to make an end to the man of God. The picture I see here is the clash of the two kingdoms, right? Jesus is bringing something else to the world, and this is what the world has, right? The people in power, this is how they act, this is what they have. That's why we always have to resist the temptation, back to your calling on the name of the Lord, to being seduced by worldly power and dependent on the power of God and His kingdom that works differently. Right.
John the Baptist's mission has to come to an end, and Jesus is continuing. What happens if this is the way it works out? There's got to be some resolution of that. The passing of the torch from John the Baptist to Jesus. This is kind of the last little step of it.
And is there another message John is Mark in relating these two stories back to back is trying to teach us? You know, sometimes we have the idea that if we just get everything lined up and everything set as it should be, everything will work fine and it'll be easy, right? It'll work like it's supposed to. Everything's fixed, and so we just move forward with it. I think Mark is trying to show us that following the call of Jesus in our earthly terms can be dangerous. Right? Here's who better example of living out the call of God than John the Baptist, and what's his end? He's killed for speaking out for truth and righteousness, pointing the way to the coming Messiah. And remember, the people are still confused. Some of them think this is John the Baptist. Jesus is John the Baptist revived, continuing the message. But that's a good connection back to you. They see the connection, right? This is the same message. Something's happening here. But I think Mark is trying to say us, yes, even though it's dangerous, and I think that's important for us when we think coming to faith, being in the kingdom of God means easy American dream. Those don't necessarily line up, but we think we can have it all, right? There could be resistance. When you mess with the structures of the world, are they going to go quietly? People who have power, are they just going to go, oh, I want to share this power and make it the same for everybody? I don't see that happening. But even beyond that, yes, there's danger, but there's something even greater than that. There's hope. Here's the kingdom of God. In this hopeless kingdom here, what is he bringing? Hope to the world in a way that they may have not seen for a long time. And then Mark jumps right back into the flow of the story in verse 30. The apostles are coming back. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. And I think those two things are important. It's not just the teaching, it's also the doing. Right? Why was Jesus recognized for his authority from God? It was in their doing. And if we only focus on the teaching, which is important, and not on the doing, our message doesn't have the same authority. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest for a while." They've been worn out. They've been traveling. They've depended on others to take care of them. They've been healing. They've been preaching. And now they're gathered back. It would be appropriate to catch the breath, to take a rest. Right? Nothing wrong with that. In fact, Jesus calls them for that. And the reason he said, let's go to a deserted place, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. I think when I learned this story as a little boy, those details weren't emphasized. The apostles are having trouble finding time to eat because of the number. They've been successful. They've extended the ministry of Jesus, and people have responded. And they went away in a boat to a deserted place by themselves. And now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. They can't get away. They get there before they even get out of the boat. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation, where you think you're going to catch your breath and it's already back. Maybe you had a little baby, right? And you finally got them to sleep and you sit down and here comes that whale again, right? Yeah, twins. There you go. You get one settled and then the other one goes. They do that on purpose, right? They say, your turn. Yeah. So that's the sense I think the disciples are having. As they went ashore, speaking, this is Jesus, he saw a great crowd. Now, think about what the apostles might have been seeing. They're seeing the work. They're seeing, when are we going to get a moment of rest? Not that they don't want to be part of the mission, but notice what Jesus sees. He sees a great crowd. And I like the way Mark puts it. And he had compassion for them because they were like a sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. So here we see that compassion of Jesus come through. What was the Davidic king supposed to be most like? A shepherd, right? He was, ideally, the king would shepherd the people in response to God, right? He's that leader. Too often the kings got sucked into the power, earthly power kind of idea. But ideally, the kings from the line of David should have been the shepherd of God's people. Not the owner of the flock, but the one who helped take and care for it.
The way earthly kings are, they attack you and raise armies and send you off to war, and you're going to feel like you're under their thumb and so on. But the Messiah king is supposed to come someday and go back to being the way the king ought to be.
Yes. Well, and again, our sympathies with them, if they've been trained in a different way of thinking about what king looks like, what Messiah was going to do, it's going to be easy for them to have the wrong expectations. That's why it's important for us to question our expectation. And am I seeing what God's really doing here and not just what I think he ought to be doing? When it grew late, and I just love this. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place and the hour now is very late. Send them away so that we may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." Enough's enough, Jesus, get them out of here. And they were not ready, I think, in any way prepared for what Jesus was about to say. But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." What's Jesus doing here? Okay, so let's back up to where we started. You're right on it. He sends them out, and what did they do? 2 by 2? They acted on his authority. People respond to that, right? The crowds are even huger now. They can't even get away. They get ahead of them to where they're going. And when they say, we can't feed all these people, see, they're progressing, but they're not all the way yet, right? Is this a problem for God to feed these people? Right. And they didn't recognize they're part of the answer. They've been out healing the sick. What is it to feed the people? It's a lot of people. Right. Yeah. And Mark doesn't give us that detail till we get right to the end. We're going to talk more about that. So they've just returned, successful in their healing and their exorcism tour. But the bigness, the economy of this situation overwhelmed them. So is their concern in serving the shepherd less or getting back to their retreat? Or their own supper, which has been overdue. They didn't even have time to eat. Or is it, and it's probably all of these things, they cannot yet see the full extent of what God's doing. Their picture is still too narrow. But again, God's put in that crowbar, and Jesus trying to open them up for them to see greater. They went out and borrowed his authority. And that's one thing, going 2 by 2. Coming back with more faith and compassion for the multitude, that's still another thing. So in part of the story, too, we're kind of seeing the Creator at work. Who creates food? Who takes loaves and fishes and multiplies them? Again, it's a reference to God as Creator. And I think the point, this is a great separate story we teach our kids, but for us, God is expanding their expectations of what's going to happen. I think that's the point for us as adults. We allow God to blow the top off of our expectation. So,
this is also a progressive teaching to the disciples of what trust is and what faith is. I mean, there really hasn't been any big God explosion, right? Since forever.
yeah.
I mean,
Maybe Ezra and Nehemiah, right?
to really see that magnificent power of God
Mm-hmm.
with the Jews
Mm-hmm.
during all these years.
Yeah.
And Jesus was changing that. And so, how much do they really understand what trust is and what faith is, and how much greater faith is going to be? There just happened to be this wild storm. So Jesus could say, okay, enough already.
Yeah.
Okay, and what does he say? You will go away. And then he sends them out with nothing except what's on their back. And they have to learn to trust that their needs will be supplied, and they are. Now, it's not connected, you know. And then they come and they're going to have all of these people. And they've got, you know what we've been doing is really attracting a lot of people. And if you extend it forward and see what they did later,
Yes.
after that, they sought out, they went. Jesus is just progressing and preparing them
Right.
for what they're going to do.
He didn't give them one test and said, you failed, I'm going to find somebody else. And what's the difference? What's the real difference between these guys and everybody else? They keep coming back to Jesus. They answer that call, right? They call upon the Lord. We don't get it. We don't understand it. We don't know everything. But they keep coming back. That's the difference. They're just as confused, just as wrong, but they keep staying with Jesus. You know, later we're going to find out Peter said, well, where else would we go? To me, that's the essence of that. We don't understand everything. We don't get it all. But there's nowhere else to go. This is it. Let's continue the story. They said to him, are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? A half a year's wages? That's what it's going to take, Jesus. Don't you get that? Again, he's trying to get them to fall in and then expand their thinking, right? And he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups of on the green grass. So they sit down in groups of hundreds and of fifties. What does that sound like? Groups of hundreds and fifties. Well, the Roman army was notorious for setting in being groups. You know, centurion means I'm over 100. I think there's some military imagery here. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, gave it to his disciples, and set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them, and all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces of the fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. So, interesting things. I'm just going to send you on some rabbit trails here. Obviously, there were probably some women and children. This just wasn't men. Or was it they are beginning to recognize this Messiah? Their expectation is overthrow the Romans. What is he going to need? An army. It could be they're trying to figure out how to volunteer and sign up for this army. They're beginning to see the possibility. John maybe gives us a better insight into this. When John tells this story, he adds a part that says they tried the crowd after the feeding of the 5,000. They tried to crown Jesus king by force. Mark doesn't include that detail, but John does. So I don't think this military connection is off base, certainly not from their expectations. They're thinking finally somebody can overthrow the Roman war machine. Go ahead. No, you're first. Yeah.
Wondering if Jesus wasn't trying to get them in the spiritual realm, thinking spiritual thoughts with several of these things, you know.
Yeah.
If they were in spiritual thought, when they were 2 by 2, and one was failing, the other one could help him up. With this, they could realize that God can do anything, and God's still God, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they get on the denarius.
Right. We get on the money.
And John has followed up in the lengthy chapter 6 with that really amazing story about how Jesus basically drove a lot of those people away.
Yeah.
He started with difficult sayings, you're going to need to eat my flesh and drink my blood. If you're not willing, you can't be one of my followers. And the people who just wanted another feeding of the 5,000, I'm here for the goodies and the earthly things, started saying, boy, this is weird. I'm out of here.
Yeah.
And so on. But that was actually by intent of Jesus that, first of all, those who weren't really open to the gospel message needed to be challenged. But secondly, like you pointed out, if they really want a crowning king, which will lead to the end of his ministry of his crucifixion after 1 year of ministry instead of 3.5 years, then he needed to do something about it. And
Yeah.
he did something about it by basically driving away a lot of those people.
But also calling and asking people to count the cost, and a lot of people say don't want to pay it, right? That's not what I'm looking for. Nothing to see here. I'm moving on. Yeah. Right. Right. Exactly. And so then Mark continues with another miraculous happening. Again, we pull this out and teach it to our kids, and that's fine because I think it's an impressive miracle. But let's keep it in the context of what Mark's trying to get us to see. There's a reason. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. Okay? We've had our teaching moment. Y'all go on ahead. Y'all do need rest. Jesus gets rid of the crowd. and after saying farewell to them, he went up to the mountain to pray. Again, I think that's how Jesus stayed centered. When you got 5,000 men saying, we want you to be king and we'll back you, that could be tempting, right? If he's a man like us, but how does he handle that? He goes to the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea and he was alone on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came towards them early in the morning, walking on the sea. And I love this next line. He intended to pass them by. I love that. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. We're back to being terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. You think they're going to have more adverse winds? I think it's a great metaphor. Are they going to be alone? But not really, right? Yeah. We're on the same page. Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. So the miracle's impressive, and it lends itself to this creator-like power. But I think the main point for us is the apostles' reaction. They are at sea. They're terrified by the foreignness of Jesus' power once again, right? It's almost a redundant story of the storm. It's the intersection of unbelief, fear, confusion, and hardness of heart that reveals the true depth of the apostles' anguish struggle to understand Jesus. Discipleship can be brutal. It's not easy. It's not for the faint of heart. There's a lot of things, there's a lot of things they needed to unlearn. I don't think I'm any different. There's stuff I know that I decided that's the way the world works when I was a young child. And lots of them I need to unlearn. That's why that verse in Luke that I found today, he opened their minds. That's just really setting with me.
The recent story with the wind and capsizing the boat and him walking on water. These fellows were professional.
Yeah.
They've been out in the water all the time. And it was like if you asked me about cars,
Yeah.
you ask them about fishing, they know.
Yeah, they've lived it their whole life.
This is fixing to be an open heart moment. They're beginning to see that this is the Son of God.
And Jesus is doing the things that are going to allow them to get to the place to see that. And I think he does that for all of us if we're calling on him, if we're looking to him. He will bring us to that point if we're open to it. When they had crossed over, let's just finish this little bit here. They came to the land at Gerizim and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him, and they rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went into villages or cities and farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak. All who were touched were healed. So the woman from chapter 5 that touched his garment, word is out. It's common practice now. The news is spreading. And so Mark he's building a tension in our story. And the tension's going to be the conflict of those who cannot put up with Jesus' expanding influence. Right? That's where the tension's going to come, and that's where Mark's leading us.
It's interesting, I think that geographically, this is kind of a fringe area on the other side of Galilee.
Yeah.
So it's kind of safer that this isn't going to bring a big conflict with the Roman authorities or the Jewish authorities. And so it's kind of safer to be doing miracles there, whereas Jesus has to occasionally be careful when he's in the thick of things. Don't tell anybody I healed you. Don't run, don't do any more of this. Don't spread this.
Exactly. That's a good observation. Closing thought. Jesus is doing all of this in the midst of the apostles' struggle with faith and understanding, and they're not spiritual giants. But I like that because it makes me think I can be right there with them in that struggle and growing, and God is going to allow me some of the same types of experiences that are going to allow me to see Him. It's not having these perfect spiritual giants. It's about having real people who call upon the Lord. I'm going to keep stealing your phrase. Glad you're here tonight. Thanks for the extra 5 minutes.